Toyota doesn't build campers. Toyota builds machines that refuse to fail. And somewhere between a fortress and a home on wheels, one six-wheeled design study slipped past the usual filters. 3 axles, a name that translates to stronghold. Call it obsession, or call it the closest thing to a Toyota that was never meant to leave the studio. By the end of this, you'll understand why almost nobody outside a small design team has seen the full spec sheet. Keep this running for the next few minutes. The number at the very end changes how everything before it reads. Picture 3 axles under one body, the rear 2 set close enough together that from the side it reads as one wide stance, rather than 2 thin wheels bolted on for show. The cab keeps a short hood and a near vertical windshield, but everything behind the B-pillar swells into a squared-off habitation box, finished in a matte concrete gray wrap, with exposed rivet lines instead of hidden seams. Wheel arches are cut wide and flat, not flared for effect. You can see the shock towers through the gap when the suspension articulates. A fold-out ladder sits flush against the rear door, and the spare mounts low, under the frame, rather than swinging off the back. Even the door hinges sit external and oversized, closer to what you'd find on a walk-in cooler than on a typical hinge door. The rear lighting is a single horizontal bar recessed into a steel bumper thick enough to double as a step, and the roofline carries a low-profile rack that sits flush, rather than adding height for the sake of looking capable. Paint goes on in 3 separate passes over a sealed primer layer, according to the build notes, specifically to survive branch scrape and sandblast without chipping down to bare metal the way a single coat finish would after one real season of use. Honest read. The rear overhang is long enough that departure angle takes a real hit the moment the camper box goes on. That trade-off doesn't disappear just because it's a concept. What you can't see from any angle so far is what's happening at the second axle, where engineers reportedly stopped treating this as one drivetrain and started treating it as 3 separate suspension problems. The concept sheet pairs a twin-turbo 3.5-liter V6 hybrid with a low-range transfer case split across all 3 axles, penciled in at 437 horsepower and 583 pound-feet of torque, enough to move a camper body rumored to clear 11,000 pounds loaded without the drivetrain feeling strained on paper. Toyota's design notes reportedly cap water fording depth at 35.4 inches, deep enough to cross a flooded causeway without slowing down. And the electronically locking differentials are said to engage independently on each axle rather than as a single front-rear pair. Approach angle is listed near 34 degrees, a figure that matters more on this build than most, given how much structure hangs behind the cab once the habitation box is bolted on. Braking hardware is oversized front and rear, 6-piston calipers up front according to the parts sheet, sized for a vehicle that's expected to carry full water and battery weight down a mountain grade, without fading halfway through the descent. Here's the figure that matters most. Only 6 rolling prototypes are said to exist at this stage, small enough that the engineers on this program could probably list every chassis by number. On paper, the third axle should mean redundancy the moment one side loses traction. In practice, that much unsprung weight behind the cab means low-speed crawling feels deliberate, almost cautious, in every account that's surfaced so far. This isn't something you flick into a corner, and nobody involved seems to be pretending otherwise. Step inside and the layout runs long ways. A wet bath tucked behind the cab, a galley with a residential-width induction cooktop, a dinette that folds flat into a second sleeping berth, and a fixed queen at the very back under a skylight. The cabinetry uses a matte walnut veneer over what's said to be a honeycomb aluminum core light enough to matter on a build already fighting its own weight. Floor seams are welded rather than glued, and the window trim is finished in the same brushed metal as the exterior door handles. So nothing about the transition from outside to inside feels like an afterthought. Even the light switches are flush-mounted toggle style rather than touch panels. A small choice that reads as deliberate once you notice how much of the rest of the cabin avoids anything that could fail in mud or salt air. The ceiling height clears just over 6'4" at the tallest point, measured from the finished floor, and the skylight above the bed is listed as electrochromic, rather than a simple vent it tints on command instead of needing a cover snapped over it at sunrise. Storage bins carry etched icons instead of printed labels: water tank, gray tank, battery bank, spare parts, tool roll. The kind of detail that suggests someone on this team has actually lived in a vehicle for months at a time, not just rendered one. Looking at this, it feels like a space built for someone who has already done the stripped-down, sleep-on-the-ground version of this hobby and outgrown it, not someone still deciding whether they want the lifestyle. There's a fold-down desk by the second window, wide enough for a laptop and a coffee, positioned exactly where you'd want it at 6 in the morning with the door cracked open and the kettle still warming up. The power architecture is where the concept gets specific. A 14.2 kilowatt lithium battery bank paired to a rooftop solar array said to be rated near 800 watts. Plus a DC-DC charge line off the hybrid drive motor itself, not just the alternator unusual enough that it's worth pausing on. Fresh water capacity sits around 55 gallons, gray water separate at 30, with a heat exchanger system routing engine warmth into the water heater instead of running a dedicated propane unit, and a UV filtration stage ahead of the galley tap. Climate control reportedly draws from a heat pump unit tucked under the dinette floor rather than a rooftop AC pod, which would explain why the roofline stays as low as it does. Connectivity runs through a satellite module mounted flat against the front cap, said to hold signal down to roughly -20 degrees. A spec that only matters to someone who actually plans on being somewhere that cold. The detail that's been harder to confirm. Sources close to the design team say the entire habitation module is engineered to unbolt from the chassis in under 2 hours, meaning the same running gear could, in theory, carry more than one body style depending on what a future owner actually needs from it. If that's accurate, it changes what this concept actually is, and it's not something Toyota has said a single word about publicly, on record or off. None of this comes at a number anyone would call modest. Industry estimates circling this concept land between $285,000 and $340,000 depending on the battery configuration, a bracket that sits in the same neighborhood as a fully loaded Patek Philippe. Nautilus. Not a down payment conversation most people are used to having about a camper. This was never built for a first-time buyer testing the idea of full-time travel on a long weekend. It reads like something engineered for someone who already owns land they don't visit often enough, who wants the trip itself to be the destination rather than a means to one, and who wants a spec sheet nobody else at the campsite can match. It's a number that assumes the buyer has already priced out a custom build from a small workshop somewhere and decided they'd rather have the factory-adjacent version instead. If that's the kind of ownership you're picturing for yourself, this concept was drawn with you in mind. So here's the reveal. The Bastion was never meant to be a comfortable weekend hauler with a rack bolted to the roof and a nice paint job. It's the vehicle a small, obsessive team builds when nobody tells them no, and that shows in every joint, every unlabeled prototype panel, every corner where practicality clearly won the argument over polish. The verdict, as far as any concept can earn one. This is closer to a proof-of-concept fortress than a product line, 6 rolling prototypes deep and probably years from a showroom, if a showroom is even the plan at all. That rarity is the whole point. You're not looking at a camper anyone can order. You're looking at what obsession looks like when a manufacturer, with nothing left to prove, decides to prove something anyway. Whether the Bastion ever reaches a customer or quietly disappears back into a design vault, this is the version worth remembering it by. Now here's the part only you can settle. Comment chassis if you want next time to tear open exactly how that third axle steers, or comment cabin if you'd rather we sit inside for a full walkthrough. Whichever word climbs highest by this time next week is what gets filmed. So if you skip this, someone else picks it for you. And if you've got a guess on what 6 rolling prototypes actually means for whether this ever leaves the design vault, drop it below. I'm reading every single one before we decide.